I'm working on my Polyfrost game, and I wrote. I talked about it in a previous podcast. I wrote Polyfrost already as a feature film script, and it's 175 pages long. It's a first draft, and it's not perfect. It needs a lot of work, but um, you got to do a first draft anyway, even if it's a piece of shit, you know. And so I was feeling a little insecure because I had finished my 175 page script and I gave it to a bunch of friends of mine. I think only two of which I ever heard back from. That was like half a year ago. So, I gave it to a bunch of people who were just like, oh, yeah, I can't wait to read it. And it's like 6 months later, still nothing. So it's like, yeah, I'm sure you couldn't wait, right? But, people are busy. They got shit to do. And it's a long script. It's a lot to ask for to sit down and read all that shit. But I genuinely tried my best to write a script that you couldn't put down. That script is fucking action-packed. I guess probably to a fault. I mean, there's so much that happens. And I deliberately made it that way because I want it to be in like an endurance test for the main character. I want it to be like a Die Hard sort of movie where the action just never lets up and the main character's just fucking exhausted trying to save the world, And so I finished the script, but barely got any feedback on it. A little bit. I mean, the people who did give me feedback, they gave me a lot of helpful feedback. And today I was re-outlining the story because, I thought my first draft was focused. It felt focused, but then now I'm starting to doubt myself, and I'm just like, you know what? That draft was a piece of shit. I got to rework this story. So I was doing that today. I was taking a step back from my Polyfrost story. I'm like, okay, what the fuck is the story here? You always got to do that, no matter what you're writing. Like I do this with Arby and the Chief too. Like I have an outline planned out, and then it's like I got to take a step back and then really dissect it. And it's like, okay, what is the fucking story here? What's my theme? What's my thematic? Because you start. I wanted to talk about writing too, and I guess I'll start here. So, say you wanna write a movie, right? You want to write a story, right? Well, where do you start? Well, you can start with either theme, plot, or character, right? Those are the main starting points. Like, if you start with theme, it's like, I want to tell a story about this idea or that idea. If you start with character, it's like, I got this character in mind, and I know I want to tell a story about him. I don't know what the story is about exactly, but I know I want it to be about this character that I have in my head. Or you can start it from a plot perspective. It's like, well, what if this happened? It's like, well, what are the themes of that? What character would I pick? Right? So you can start from a number of jumping off points, but the important thing to prioritize is theme. Like as quickly as possible. You don't have to start with theme, but if you start with something else like plot or character, you should work your way to thematic as quickly as possible. Get that out of the way. Like figure out what the theme is of the story you're trying to tell. Because the theme dictates the course of the whole story, Because ultimately you're trying to tell a story with a message or a moral, you know what I mean? Because otherwise, a movie without a theme is just a string of stuff that happens with no real meaning embedded in it. So, you sit down in the theater ultimately bored by 2 hours of explosions, and then you walk out of the theater going, well, what the fuck did that mean? This is why you have to rein it all in with a thematic. So you have people walking out of the theater going, you know what? That movie was about something, and it was very clear that it was about something, and I got it, and it's a good message, and I like that movie as a result. That's the kind of feeling you want to leave people with. So if you imagine theme, plot, and character as 3 points in a triangle, right? If you also envision a smaller triangle within that triangle, and that's your sweet spot. That's where you want your movie to be, right? A movie that strikes a balance between theme, plot, and character, right? Because if you go too much into one direction and you start neglecting the ones around it, then you kind of have a shit movie. That's how you end up with something like Transformers. If you favor plot all the way, if on that triangle, Transformers would be like 100% plot, but absolutely zero character or theme. So it's like, I'm not connecting with any of the characters, and this movie isn't about a fucking thing. So it just sucks. So you gotta strike a balance, right? And so you figure out your theme, right? When you do finally figure out your theme, then it's like, okay, so what's my character gonna be? What's my main character? Is it a man or a woman? What character would best serve as a vehicle for the theme of the story I'm trying to tell, right? Because that's what a character is. It's a thematic vehicle. You figure out your theme, and it's like, what character would best serve to drive this theme forward? And so that's what you figure out what that character is. And then you go from there, you go on to plot. And you're like, okay, well, what is the string of events that I'm guiding this character through that evokes that theme? You know what I mean? So once you figure out those 3 key points, then you can start like fleshing out the story. And that's what I was doing with Polly Frost earlier today. I'm just took a step back from my first draft. I'm like, okay, let's whittle this down. What is the fucking story I'm trying to tell here? I want to tell a story, like, what's the theme? The theme is like bullying and the cycle of violence and the idea that violence breeds more violence. And this whole like Nietzschean, Jungian thing of like the shadow self, stare into the abyss long enough, the abyss stares back at you, that kind of shit. That's the kind of themes I'm getting at. And so why did I pick Polly as a character? Well, I like penguins. I think they're cool as fuck. And I want to tell a story about terrorism with somebody at the heart of it who's very small in stature, because I want to tell a story about how it doesn't matter how big or physically big or strong you are. It's your inner will to do what needs to be done that drives you forward to doing stuff that ends up saving the world or stopping terrorism, right? That's the kind of story I wanted to tell. And so, okay, so I'm like, I have this theme, I have this character. So I started trying to nail down my plot anchor points. It's like, what's the absolute minimum amount of plot points that I need to tell this thematic effectively? So you start thinking about the hero's journey, right? So the hero's journey, pretty much the template for every functional good action movie. It's like you have you open the story with the world as it should be for the character in a state of normalcy, right? And you establish the character, and you establish that the character has a problem. There's something that the character wants, and there's something that the character needs. And usually the character is not aware of the need right away. They learn what their need is throughout the course of the story. But right away, they start off the story wanting something, but it's not the same as what they need. But they want something, and that gives them a goal to start with, right? So you establish the opening, setting the world in a state of normalcy, and then you introduce your character, you introduce the problem that character has, and then you have what's called the call to adventure. And what is that moment? The initial call to adventure and the refusal of the call, which is important because that establishes your character as being in one state of mind that you ultimately want to change throughout the course of the movie. You want the beginning of the movie, the state your character is in at the beginning of the movie, you want that to contrast as sharply as possible with what your character becomes by the end of the movie. You know what I mean? And So the call to adventure and the refusal of the call is an important moment. You don't want your main character to answer the call to adventure right away, because that's an important moment of growth that you want to build to. So when the call to adventure first happens, you want the character to be like, "Oh no, that's not for me." You need to establish that, right? Stop talking about cinema, you pretentious Hollywood psycho. Fuck you. Why don't you get out of the stream if this is a problem? Anyway, so you establish the state of being, call to adventure, refusal of the call, and then the inciting incident, right? So something happens that throws the main character's world out of balance, and then that forces the main character into taking action. It's like, well, I've got no choice now. I refused the first time, but now I've got to do it for sure now. And that's what drags your character into the second act of the story, right? And so you start building up. You go from there, right? It's like, and the second act of the story, by the way, is a lot of the time the hardest thing. It's like, well, what do you fill it up with? Well, you start off by dividing Act 2 into 2 parts. This is what is commonly referred to as the 4-act structure, but you don't necessarily have to look at it that way, because you basically just look at the middle 2 acts of a 4-act structure as one giant second act. But you split them into 2 parts just so you have 4 quadrants of equally sized story proportions, right? So you got your first act, first half of second act, second half of second act, and then your third act, which is your resolution, right? And in between the second act, you want your midpoint to be something that kind of, it's like a point in the story where the stakes are raised dramatically. It's like, okay, we're not kidding around anymore. Fuck. Like, something terrible is going on. And then Act 2 is basically just a series of obstacles. Usually you obey the rule of 3s in this regard, and you have 3 main obstacles that your main character has to overcome. And then around the middle of the second act, you have what I refer to as the false victory. Other people call it the false sense of security. Some people disagree with me on this, but I think this is the most effective method of telling at least a good action movie story, at least. Is you have your false sense of security, and then you have disaster strike, right? And then that's when you have your main character thrown into the dark night of the soul, where they're confronted with their they're facing their inner problem for the first time head on. They're coming face to face with it, and they finally got to make a change. This is the point of metamorphosis for the main character that leads them into the third act and to doing what they finally really have to do to bring resolution to the full story, right? And the crisis which is at the end of Act 2 is often very revealing of what the theme of the story is, right? So the crisis is a hugely important moment, and it's often the point in the story that I think about first. It's like, before I even written any other part of the story, it's like, well, what would the crisis be, right? Because that's the point where it's like everything goes off the rails. It's one of the most important parts of the story. It's where all the cards are put on the table. You know what I mean? I think we get it, John. Well, good for you. Fuck. A lot of people ask me for this advice, and I'm finally getting to it. So, I mean, I know a lot of you guys get this already. I mean, personally, I would love to hear people talk about this kind of shit. I wish people would do it more often. It's like, why do we love the movies that we love? Well, there's a reason for it. Structure is everything, you know? And so that's the perspective I was looking at my first draft of Polly Frost from. It's like, okay, what can I move? It's very plotty, what I have so far. So, like, how can I strip this down, but still tell the story that I ultimately set out to tell in the first place, right? You trim all the fat out of it. That's what a first draft is for, right? So you can write a second draft that's much more cleaned up and efficient, right? So that's what I was doing with Polyfrost. And of course, I mentioned before that I've announced plans to turn this into a game. The original idea was to write at least a pilot episode for like a series that would hopefully go on Netflix or something like that, like an animated series. But now I want to turn it into a video game that I've actually made some progress in making. I have a video I uploaded onto YouTube. It's like a Polyfrost Development Log 1, which is basically my very first early build of Polyfrost, where I would turn it into a game with a continuous campaign that's kind of seamless. You know, kind of the way that Half-Life 2 was seamless, where you just like, there's no like visible loading times. Or there are loading times in Half-Life 2, but it's not like a hard cut to black or anything like that. It's not like Fable. Remember Fable, where it's just like, it's so rigidly cut up into these sections of the world, you know? It's like you leave one section, you enter another. It's like a cut to black, and it's a loading screen, and it's like, okay, we're in this area now. I love Fable. Yeah, Fable's good. I'm not knocking Fable, by the way. I love the first one. The second one, I think I like the second one too. I didn't play the third one. But they're great games, but there's a very specific design approach with that game. It's like, because you're splitting Fable up into very rigid sections of world that you can explore, that means you can fill up those sections of world with very elaborate detail, you know? You can have all these NPCs and, you know, characters with dialogue and really breathe life into those relatively small chunks of world, relative to, say, something like Grand Theft Auto or something like that, where it's just this massive sandbox with no loading times pretty much, or very little loading times, where you can just run all over the place, do whatever. Or that's a very non-linear example. I mean, in the case of Half-Life 2, that's a very linear experience, but it's all constructed in a way that seems seamless. You know what I mean? And so that's kind of what I want Polyfrost to be, is this continuous seeming campaign that doesn't really take a break. And I want it to be like a mix of Resident Evil and Hotline Miami and Metal Gear Solid Snake Eater. Like, I have all these ideas that I want to put into it. And I want there to be a compelling story at the heart of it that actually makes you feel something. You actually connect with the character. That's my ultimate goal with Polyfrost. You know, if it stands out in any way, I want it to be that, is like narrative and making the player feel something, you know? That's why The Last of Us was so fucking good. You know? That game made you actually feel something. You connected with the characters. You cared about what the fuck happened to them. You know? That's my ultimate objective with this. And so, since my first build of Polyfrost, I've made quite a bit of progress. I felt terrible for a little while there, because I felt like I hit a wall with the game development. I was just like, oh, this isn't going to turn out the way I want it to. There's a bunch of shit I'm not going to fucking figure out. Because I was like having all these coding problems where I couldn't even like I built this one room in GameMaker Studio, and every time I ran it, it worked. But then I created a main menu and like a button leading to the room, and all of a sudden I was getting all these error reports and crashing, and I'm just like, what the fuck is the problem? It's like, oh, it's not making sense. It's not clear what the problem is here, so I don't know if I'm ever going to be able to figure it out. Even with the vague fucking debug shit that it was telling me, I'm just like, I don't really know what that means. I don't know what value to change here, you know? But I recently found this great tutorial on YouTube that walked me through it and walked me through all the coding and what the coding is exactly, and explaining what all the numbers are and what variables they correspond to. And so I managed to code my game to the point where I have good wall collision. I have a camera that follows the player wherever he walks. The camera shakes whenever he fires his gun. The camera shakes when enemy characters fire their gun. The camera shakes. I have if Polly fires or any enemies fire their guns, it shoots out smoke from the tip of the gun barrel. I have that, even though it's just basically a gray sphere that fades in not opacity. Oh yeah, opacity, yeah. So it just goes from 100 to 0, basically. No, I'm not copy pasting code, but I did follow a tutorial basically where I wrote it all out. I'm just like, okay, that's how you do that. That's how you do that. And then you basically plug in your own sprites and your own kind of like, there's slightly different things that I want the game to do compared to the tutorial that I'm following. The tutorial I was following was more for like an asteroids type thing, where enemies are always coming at you from all sides, and I want mine to be more of like a top-down strategic sort of thing with corridors that's grounded in something resembling reality. You know what I mean? So that involves different enemy code, right? And right now, that's what I'm working on, is the enemy code. Because the tutorial I followed doesn't account for walls being in the way in between the player and the enemies that can cut off the enemy's line of sight. That's a big thing that I got to fix. So basically it just involves, what I've got to do is find a way to, for every frame of the game that occurs, right? You can set a game to run at 30 or 60 frames per second. In my case, it's 60 frames per second. And so every frame of that gameplay, you want a new line to be drawn between your player and wherever the enemies are in the room that you're in, right? And if that line that is drawn collides with a wall, then that means that the enemy can't see you. But if that line is not colliding with a wall at any given point, that means the enemy can see you and then starts targeting you. And if you are X amount of distance away, or rather than X amount of distance, I should say a radius, right? So I need to give each enemy, in addition with that sight line, they need to each have 2 radii around them, right? And so the outer radii, the outer radius, is the enemy's awareness field. So if I step into that first radius, then the enemy acknowledges my presence, looks in my direction, and starts running in my direction, right? And then the inner radius that's drawn, a smaller circle around the enemy character, if I am within range of that, then the enemy stops chasing me and remains stationary, but is still aware of me, of where I am, is still facing in my direction, and is still firing at me. He's just not chasing me anymore, right? So it's just programming these different enemy states, right? You want, for enemy states, you want like, assuming the enemy is not aware of your presence, of the player's presence, there's like patrol and stationary, right? And then there's subsets within those states. There's like, if an enemy is stationary, maybe they're just looking in one direction. Or maybe they're stationary, but they rotate between multiple looking directions. So you've got to time it correctly. Like if it's a stealth mission, you've got to like wait until they're looking in this direction, and then you quickly run from one corridor to another, that kind of thing, right? Or that maybe they have a fixed direction that they're looking at, where it's like, okay, they're always looking in that direction, so how do I work my way around that, right? Or if it's not just stationary, maybe they have some kind of patrol route. So it's like, okay, you have to give them not only a walking animation, but a walking speed, and then have them walk around a path that you designate, right? So you draw out like a patrol path, and you have to program it so whenever the enemy enters a state of awareness that you are aware, that you are in the room with him, and the enemy is aware that you're there, the enemy diverts from that path. For wherever the enemy is along that path, that logic stops. And then that person then focuses his attention on you and starts chasing you and starts making that's another thing too that I'm trying to figure out. It's like you don't want the enemy to just make a beeline towards you because there might be stuff in his way. So how do you program the enemy to make his way around colliding objects and walls and shit? And how do you make them do more specific shit, nuanced shit, like taking cover behind walls or behind crates or something, right? And actually being smart as opposed to just coming at you head on. I mean, that's something I'm trying to figure out. I don't know if I ever will really figure it out. So my at least in my first version of Polyfrost, the enemy AI might be kind of half-assed just because I'm just learning this shit. You know, I don't really know how to properly do it, but I get the basics of what I would have to do, the kind of shit I would have to program. Like, for instance, that sight line, and then those the awareness radii, and then the chase radii, right? So that's what I'm working on. And compared to that, a lot of the other shit is easy, you know? I mean, another complicated thing is setting up cutscenes, but I'm pretty sure I can figure that out. That's just time consuming, but I feel like it's doable. Like I can eventually get it done. The enemy AI, though, I'm still kind of lost. I'm not quite sure if I'll get it the way I want it, or perhaps the way it needs to be, you know, in order to be something that people will actually be interested in playing, you know, because you don't want it to be too simplistic.